I really appreciate Ryan making that connection of my name being Walker, and us walking through something very original. Never have heard that one before. So appreciated of my coworker in Christ today. That is just the best thing ever. No, but I love Ryan. You know, actually, I caught myself making a similar pun about my name a while back, so it happens. I just want to say I love to hear good news. I'm sure you love to hear good news too. Good news like my debt, the mortgage that I've been covering for over years and years now is finally paid off. Or that cancer diagnosis is finally cleared. I'm cancer-free again. That good news that my child who's been growing in the womb for 9 months is finally born. We love to hear good news. And good news becomes so much better, so much sweeter, so much greater whenever that good news is in contrast to bad news, to a problem that needs to be overcome. Like that news that you are cancer-free is so much sweeter and so much better because you've walked through and have faced the challenges and the horrific challenges of fighting cancer. Or that debt that you are waiting to finally pay off after years and years of having to just throw your money towards this debt payment. Good news is so much better in response to something else. And in the Bible, whenever we see this certain term that comes up. It's a Greek word called euangelion, and it's this word right here, this word gospel. That's how we translate it. You've probably heard of the gospel, whether you've been in church for years or have been in church for 30 minutes, you've probably heard this word at some point in your life. When we translate this Greek word more directly, it's really a word that means good news. And when we talk about in church circles, when we talk about this gospel, this good news, it's about this person named Jesus Christ. That the story of Jesus is good news of some sort. That there is something that we desperately need to hear and rejoice over and celebrate with the arrival of this person named Jesus. And while we will uncover and understand this good news of Jesus, we have to take a step back first and ask a more foundational question. This is the simple question: why? Why do we need to hear about this good news in the first place? Like, why does this story of Jesus even matter? Because for some of us, we live in this life and we think everything is good and fine and dandy, that there's no problems or issues really within us or within our world. And if that's the case, if there's nothing wrong, if everything is seemingly good, then the result of that means that this news about Jesus is just some nice information. But what if that wasn't the case? What if we desperately needed to hear this news? What if there was more to this world, to this story, to this life than simply on the surface level? What if this is news that we as individuals desperately need to hear? What if it's more than that? What if this is news that our world, the cosmos, desperately needs to hear? And maybe as we think about that, maybe as we go beyond maybe some of our preconceived ideas, we realize and feel that something in this world just feels not right. That something feels just a little bit off right now. We get that feeling every time war breaks out in our world. Every time that there is injustice that takes place. Every time there is relational fallout in our lives. Every time whenever we find ourselves in a toxic spiral, it reminds us, this feeling, that something is not right. Something is off about the world we live in. But that wasn't always the case. In fact, if we were to go before anything was, there was an eternal, all-powerful, being. A being who decides to create the universe. At the very beginning of the biblical story in Genesis, it says this in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. At the very beginning of the narrative, we see that God, this all-powerful, eternal being, he decides to create the universe. Begins to fashion and form and design the cosmos, but he doesn't simply just create for the sake of creating. He doesn't just let it go and just let it run off into chaos, but instead what we find is that God, in creating the cosmos, he's ordering it all. And that's what we see in the rest of Genesis 1. We see God ordering the cosmos, his creation, into existence. For the first half of Genesis 1, the first several days of creation, we see God just forming. He forms light. He forms a firmament that separates. He separates the land, the dry land from the seas, and allows plant life to flourish. And after he's done forming, God goes on in the second half to fill what he has formed. He fills the cosmos with the sun, the moon, the stars. He fills the sea and the skies with creatures. He fills the land with creatures to dwell and crawl on. Throughout, God is not just creating, but he is ordering everything that he is creating. He's fashioning the cosmos. And by creating all of these things and by being in power over all these things, God is revealing, he's establishing his reign over all things, that God is the cosmic king of creation. Which is why that the scriptures will say things like this in the Psalms here, where he says, the Lord has established his throne in heaven, and his kingdom rules over all. Throughout Scripture, we see this repeated call that his throne, his reign is over all things, that God is the cosmic king, first revealed in his sovereign rule over all creation. But the beautiful thing about this is that as God is ordering all things, he completes his ordering with the creation of one final creature, human beings. But these human beings, these creatures, are created different. They are given a distinct identity, and they're given a distinct responsibility. As God fashions man and woman, he says this in Genesis 1, it says this in Genesis 1, 27, 28. So God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. And then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. You see, when God is ordering the cosmos, he comes down to humanity and he creates in them a distinct identity. They are made in God's image. To be God's image means that you are a reflection, a representative of God. That when we are in our world living, we are living as reflections or representatives of God to the rest of creation. But what are we reflecting? What are we representing? We're representing his kingly rule. That when God created us in his image, he has given us the responsibility to co-rule with him over the rest of creation. That we are to continue his path of ordering. That we are to continue ordering the cosmos alongside him. What an amazing privilege that is. That we have given this amazing privilege to be having God's delegated authority. That this all-powerful eternal being has chosen for us to walk alongside him and partner with him in continuing to order his creation. And all he asks in return is that we honor his ordering. That we respect and submit to his reign as king over all. And imagine for a moment a world that operates in that way. Imagine a world where humanity is working alongside and with God rather than against him. Imagine a world that brings about flourishing and peace and order. Imagine a world that could be. It's an amazing picture to think about. And as God reigning as king, he does what a king should do. Any good king should bring about order and flourishing and peace into his land. And God does that alongside us. But every kingdom comes to a point where it's proven. What will the citizens of God's kingdom do when they're at a crossroads? Will they honor God and honor God's reign? Will they choose to follow his ways? Or will they choose to reject God's reign? You see, where God reigns, creation flourishes. But what happens where people choose not to honor God's reign? We find out pretty quickly in the story of scriptures. Because God, he places the first two image bearers into a garden at this beautiful place of flourishing. He says to them that they can eat of any tree within this garden. Any tree except one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that if they just withhold from eating this, if they honor his law and his ways, they will continue to flourish. But to disregard his reign will mean that they will be destined to die. And within the garden comes a dragon. This serpent that whispers deceptive words into the ears of the image bearers. But the reality is that the words that the serpent is saying is simply the words that the image bearers wanted to hear. That if they were to just eat this fruit and disregard God's law, then they would become like God. That they would be able to choose and define good and evil for themselves. And so, this is what ends up happening. In Genesis 3, the woman saw that the tree was good for food and delightful to look at, and it was desirable for obtaining wisdom. So she took some of its fruit and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. The two image bearers, they decide to say to God that you are no longer our king. They decide that they can decide for themselves what is good and what is wrong, what is helpful and what is bad, what is flourishing and what is destructive. And so they decide in their prideful arrogance to choose to eat of this fruit. But understand, this is really important, at this moment where these two image bearers choose to eat of this fruit, it's not simply just a disregard of God's command. This is an act of treason against his kingdom. That they have willfully and intentionally gone against God's reign. They have effectively dethroned them from their lives and their mind. And when God's reign is rejected, chaos follows. And that's exactly what ends up happening. Everything turns upside down immediately. God eventually confronts the man and the woman of what they had just done. And what ends up happening is that the serpent is cursed. The serpent's cursed to be within enmity with the humans. And that the man and woman are promised hardships in their life. And that they are destined to die. And then even the ground, the earth is cursed. To have thistles and hardships form from it. That the cosmos undergo this curse as a result of the chaos that humans had let into creation. And rejecting the ordering that God had set forth. And in our world today, thousands of years removed from this moment, humans continue to follow that line of the first image bearers, where we choose for ourselves what is good and what is evil, where we think to ourselves, God's reign, God's ways, God's order is not good enough for us. I know better than he does. And when we reject God's reign, chaos follows. And so we live in a world, we experience a world that is full of complete chaos. Chaos as a result of the treason that humans have committed against God's kingdom. The treason that is the result, that results in disorder and hardship. Where from this point on in human history, there will be continuous patterns of slavery, of oppressive rule, of injustice, of hardship, of relational fallout, of death, and so much more beyond that. And by rejecting God's reign as king, there becomes a void. That someone else has to become the one on the throne. And so humans try and attempt to assert someone else on the throne over all things. Where they try and find someone else or something else that can possibly rule in its place. Oftentimes in our own lives, we make ourselves the ones on that throne. Other times, humanity finds themselves looking for others, where they place false, corrupt leaders in that position, where they turn to other gods and idols to worship and bow down to. What ends up happening ultimately is that there are other rival powers at work, competing for the throne against God. And ultimately, when we decide to disrupt God's reign and pull him off of that throne in our lives, what ends up happening is that these other rival powers such as corrupt leaders, powers such as sin, such as death, such as spiritual forces, what ends up happening is that they end up coming in and ruling, but fail to rule in the order that God has set up. And when God's reign is rejected, chaos follows completely. But here's the thing that we have to know in this story. Even though it may look like it, even though it might seem like it, even though everyone thinks it, God has not actually lost his reign as king. God continues to be sovereign over all of his creation. It's just that his creation has rejected that reality and has brought curses upon the cosmos. It's in God's nature to not allow chaos to run rampant, but instead it's in his nature to bring order amongst the chaos. And so in his desire for order and to restore creation back to its rightful place, what he chooses to do is to make steps to make that happen. To reenact, to re-reveal his reign over all people once again. To bring about the end to the curses that this chaos has brought. And God decides to do it in an amazing way. Because just as God partnered with humans, his image bearers, to co-rule, he wants to partner with his humans to spread his reign throughout the earth. It's this amazing thing where God doesn't just want to restore or reenact or reveal his reign, but he also wants to restore our vocation as co-rulers, as delegates of his authority over all things. And so God, he eventually chooses a man named Abraham to bring about his reign again throughout all things. And he gives this promise to Abraham in Genesis. It says this in Genesis 12. I forgot about this. This is such a key part of the story too. What ends up happening is not just that they face these curses, but they're ultimately exiled from God's presence, these image bearers are. So the Lord sent him away from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. And in the next slide, he drove the man out and stationed the cherubim and the flaming, whirling sword out of the Garden of Eden to guard the way of the tree of life. There's no way back to God's presence. That humans can try all they want, but in the chaos that they've developed, in the rejection of God's reign, they will continue to fail time and time again. But that time will come to an end, hopefully, through a man named Abraham, which is where in Genesis, God says this to Abraham: I will bless those who bless you, I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt, and all the people on the earth will be blessed through you. There's this promise that through Abraham, the nations will be blessed. Now, in Abraham following God's ways, the nations will eventually be blessed. But then Abraham's lineage expands, and it becomes a people known as Israel. And God says this to Israel at one point. He says this in the book of Exodus: now, if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, you will be my own possession out of all peoples, although the whole earth is mine. And then this: and you will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. God promises Israel that they will be a kingdom of priests. What that means is that they are God's representatives to the nations, that they bring God to the nations and they bring the nations to God. Now, if they just simply follow God's ways, if they submit to his rule as king, if they honor his law, then they will spread his reign throughout the earth. And that all the nations will one day be blessed through them and come forth in God's ways. But unfortunately, Israel fails to complete this or fulfill this vocation. What ends up happening is that Israel falls into the same pattern that the first image bearer Adam fell into. Adam, he was placed in this land, and Israel was placed in a land. Both of them were given divine commands on what to do and what not to do, and what will honor God and what will lead to flourishing. Both of them were warned about the consequences of what would happen if they didn't follow God's ways. And ultimately, both decide to reject God's reign. With Israel, the very first chance they had, they decided they don't want God to be their king of their nation, but instead they want human kings to rule on their behalf. And they choose to let in other gods to worship and follow and listen to rather than the God of all things. And ultimately, Adam, he ends up exiled out of God's presence, out of his land. And Israel, eventually, in their rejection of God as king, they are exiled out of their land as well. What we find and reminded of Israel's own story in this moment, at this point in time, is two things, I think. One, humans will never, on their own, they will never be able to actually bring restoration. Human beings on their own will never be able to enact good rule over all things. They will never be able to bring God's perfect order around all things. Instead, the inevitability of humans on their own is to instead bring about chaos. But the other flip side of this, the other thing we learn from Israel's story in this moment is that God continues to pursue his promises. That God continues to pursue a desire to bring about order and goodness and flourishing. That he wants to bring about restoration. That in the midst of Israel's falling short, when they are underneath human kings, there's one particular king, a good king named David, who is promised by God that out of him will come, out of his lineage will come a king who will reign and enact justice and goodness and will reign forever. And then eventually Israel, they are pushed into exile, but even on their way to exile, even within exile, they have this expectation that God will not let this be the end, that chaos is not the end, but that God is a God who brings about order, and this order will take place through an anointed king. A king God will come, that will prove, who will be anointed by the Spirit, who will bring about God's reign to the nations again. Which is why we see in the book of Isaiah what we call these messianic prophecies. An anointed one means Messiah, and Messiah means anointed one in Hebrew. And there's these expectations of the Israelite people of this Messiah who is to come. Like in this verse in Isaiah here, in Isaiah 9, it says this: "For a child will be born for us, a son will be given to us, and the government will be on his shoulders. He's going to reign and rule over. He will be named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace." And then he goes on and says, "The dominion will be vast and its prosperity will never end. He will reign on the throne of David and over his kingdom to establish and sustain it with justice and righteousness from now on and forever." There's this expectation that a king will be born, a king will come, and he will have dominion and rule over all things. And in that rule, good things will follow. Such as here, later on in Isaiah, there's this other messianic expectation where it says, it's as if the Messiah is speaking in this moment, and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord God is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and freedom to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of our God's vengeance, to comfort all who mourn." There is this hope, this desire, this expectation that through this Messiah, God will reign through him, and this Messiah will reign over all things and produce liberty. That he will bring about freedom from the evil, oppressive rule. That the exile will end, that restoration will follow, that he will bring about order, justice, and mercy, and peace, and flourishing. There's one other messianic expectation I want us to hear today, and it's a little bit before us in Isaiah 52. It says this: "How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of the herald who proclaims peace, who brings news of good things, who proclaims salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns." This phrase, news of good things, this is an English translation of Hebrew. There's also a Greek translation of this text that's being used around the same time. And if we translate that in English, they use the word euangelion, the word gospel here. And why that is so significant is that it reveals to us that the people of Israel, the people of God, they have this expectation of good news, but this good news is not simply just your acts of treason have been cleared and wiped away. But the good news is this promise that God reigns once more. And the good news of Israel is that the king that is to come has finally arrived, and with that comes this restored thing. With this king that has come, it brings about flourishing for the nations. That through this king that comes, the nations of the earth will be blessed. That through this king that comes, he will enact good rule and peace and justice. That's the good news. And friends, we live in a world right now where things don't feel quite right. The story of humanity is a story where the evil powers continue to rule, a story where there's continued injustice, where there's continued rebellion, where there's continued brokenness in our world. And because that's the world that humanity has experienced, because that's the world that some of us have experienced, we desperately, so desperately need to hear this good news. We need this good news. We need good news that restores God's reign over his world. We need good news where God finally is revealed and recognized as king once more. We desperately need good news that defeats the evil powers that rule. We need someone who is able to reign and no longer let evil happen again. We desperately need good news that brings order to the cosmos, that fixes the chaos that we find ourselves rampant under. We need good news that restores rebels to their rightful king. That says your acts of treason no longer matter. We need good news that fulfills Israel's messianic expectations. We need a gospel message that declares that this anointed king has finally arrived. And friends, we're going to get and look at what this good news is next week, but I would be wrong to not share a brief answer. and that this good news is the good news of Jesus. That with Jesus comes this announcement that the King of Israel's expectations has finally come. That this is a king that brings victory over the evil powers. That this is a king that brings order in the midst of chaos. That this is a king that brings good, final rule over all things. Now this is a king that points us back to God who is sovereign over all. And when God's reign is recognized, where God reigns, he flourishes. But where God's reign is rejected, chaos follows. And so we desperately need this good news of Jesus, that rightfully brings us back to recognizing God's reign over all things. And some of you today, maybe you have not experienced the reign of Jesus. Maybe you don't really even know much about this reign of Jesus. Maybe today you want to submit yourself to the reign of Jesus and say, you're my king, and I'll make God the rightful king in my life. I will share in all things who Jesus is. If one of those things might be true of you, at the end of each of these messages in this series, there's going to be a time that we invite you to make that happen. And maybe today you want to hear the good news and receive that good news for the first time. During this next song, I'll be up here. There'll be elders in the back who would love to have a conversation with you on what that looks like.